My name is Jennifer Newsome Martin. I teach here in the Program of Liberal Studies in the Department of Theology, and I'm delighted to be able to introduce our three panelists this morning. The first speaker is Alvino-Mario Fantini, who studied English literature, philosophy, and religion as an undergraduate at Dartmouth College. He has graduate degrees in international development, public policy, and financial journalism, and has worked as an editor and speechwriter for various international and multilateral organizations. Currently, he's editor-in-chief of the European Conservative and a member of the board of the Center for European Renewal. His interests include Occamist nominalism, counter-Enlightenment thought, Augustan poetry and literature, and conservative political theory. He's currently working on a doctoral dissertation at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands, and he will be speaking on the Marchmain effect, Charles Ryder's transformative friendship with the Flyte family in Evelyn Waugh's Brideshead Revisited. Our next speaker is Professor Raymond Haines, who is Associate Professor of Philosophy and the Associate Director of the Humanities Program at Providence College in Providence, Rhode Island. His research interests include ethics, applied ethics, philosophy and literature, and the work of Alexis de Tocqueville. He is the editor most recently of Beyond the Self, Essays in honor of W. David Solomon. Our final speaker today is Michael P. Murphy, who directs the Catholic Studies program in the Hank Center for the Catholic Intellectual Heritage at Loyola University, Chicago. His research interests are in theology and literature, critical theory, and Christian spirituality, but he also writes and engages public media on issues in eco-theology, ethics, and the literary and political cultures of Catholicism. Mike is a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellow. His first book, A Theology of Criticism, from Oxford University Press, was named a distinguished publication in 2008 by the American Academy of Religion. His most recently scholarly work is an edited volume, freshly out, I think, last month, called This Need to Dance, This Need to Kneel, Denise Levertov and the Poetics of Faith. He's currently at work on a monograph entitled The Dirty Realists, Catholic Fiction, Poetry, and Film, 1965 to 2015. And he'll be speaking to us a paper called Yours Truly, Epistolary Friendships and the Habit of Being. And as is the custom, we'll spend about 18 to 20 minutes on the papers and then open it up for a 15-minute question and answer session after that. So we'll welcome our first speaker.
Good morning. Brideshead Revisited, Evelyn Waugh's 1945 masterpiece, has basically all the elements you need for a great story. Exotic locales, beautiful art, romance, love, tragedy, and war. But it's friendship that is one of its most important elements. And perhaps I should start by asking how many people here have read the novel? Nice, good to see. But for those few of you, that handful that I saw that hasn't read the novel, let me just briefly summarize the story. Subtitled, The Sacred and Profane Memories of Captain Charles Ryder, most of the book takes place in the past, but it begins and ends in the present, in Charles Ryder's present, which is England sometime during the Second World War. Captain Ryder, Charles, and his army unit have set up camp temporarily on what turns out to be the estate of Brideshead Castle. And I'll show it to you. There's Captain Charles Ryder, and here's the castle as it's portrayed in the 1981 series that you've probably seen. Brideshead Castle is owned by the House of Marchmain, the Catholic aristocratic Flyte family. Seeing the castle by the light of morning, a bewildered Charles has a rather Proustian moment and is overwhelmed by, quote, a multitude of sweet and natural and long forgotten sounds, end quote. He recalls being a student at Oxford University, where he had a rather decadent lifestyle, courtesy of Lord Sebastian Flyte, the family's youngest son. Charles then recounts various romances, adventures, and misadventures, many involving members of the Flyte family, particularly Sebastian, whom he loved. Charles eventually becomes a painter, marries, while Sebastian sinks into dissolute living and alcoholism. Years later, Charles reconnects with Sebastian's married older sister, Lady Julia Flyte, with whom he begins an adulterous relationship. His memories end just before the epilogue with various tragic events and revelations. And so when we return to the present in the epilogue, we are back at the temporary camp set up at Brideshead Castle, and we see Charles, an agnostic throughout the whole of his memories, visiting the castle's private chapel and praying before the Blessed Sacrament. So scholars looking at the novel have usually focused on one of several themes. 3 years ago, in a building that apparently is no longer here, I spoke about the idea of beauty in the novel. Other more intrepid scholars have insisted that its primary theme is class, or perhaps even homosexuality. But neither, though interesting, neither is essential to the drama at the heart of the story. In fact, in a 1947 memo to MGM Studios, which was then considering a film version of the novel, Evelyn Waugh stated pithily, "The theme is theological." He then went on and said, "The story deals with the operation of grace." In other words, it's the story of conversion. That moment, according to Gregory Wolfe, quote, "of personal illumination when an individual is suddenly vouchsafed a sense of the meaning of things," end quote. Waugh himself, for those of you who don't know, converted to Rome in 1930, 15 years before Brideshead. So Catholicism is essential to the novel. So is the theme of friendship. For it is precisely through Charles's various friendships with the different members of the Flyte family that he learns about the faith and what it means to live the faith, and is able to reach, in the words of Robert Hugh Benson, the quote, "one supreme friendship to which all human friendships point, the one ideal friend in whom we find perfect and complete that for which we look in type and shadow in the faces of our human lovers," end quote. So we'll start with Sebastian. There he is on the right, played by Anthony Andrews, and Charles on his left, and Aloysius the teddy bear. As an Oxford undergraduate, Charles had been befriended by the beautiful Lord Sebastian Flyte, and the two had rapidly and easily developed the kind of friendship that C.S. Lewis describes as one of the four loves. Through Sebastian, Charles is not only introduced to an enchanted aristocratic world, but also, almost accidentally, to the Catholic faith, which starts him on the path to Rome, though it takes years, decades. Sebastian's friendship serves thus as a conduit for the faith, and it does so in several ways. I'll go through this very quickly. First, Sebastian speaks openly of his own dependence on God. He exclaims one day, "Oh dear, it's very difficult being a Catholic." Charles replies, "Does it make much difference to you?" "Of course, all the time." "Well, I can't say I've noticed it. Are you struggling against temptation? You don't seem much more virtuous than me." He says, "I'm very, very much wickeder." He says that indignantly, by the way. So Sebastian knows he needs the faith, very much recalling John 15:5, "Without me you can do nothing." Second, Sebastian's approach to the faith is quite simple, rather childlike. Charles, speaking of the church one day, asks him, "I suppose they try to make you believe an awful lot of nonsense." Sebastian replies, "Is it nonsense? I wish it were. It sometimes sounds terribly sensible to me." "But my dear Sebastian, you can't seriously believe it all, can't I? I mean about Christmas and the star and the three kings and the ox and the ass." "Oh yes, I believe that. It's a lovely idea." "But you can't believe things because they're a lovely idea." "But I do. That's how I believe." So Sebastian believes precisely in the way that our Lord wants us to believe, recalling Matthew 18:3, "Change and become like little children." Years later, when Charles visits Sebastian in Morocco to deliver news of Sebastian's mother's death, he finds him in a Franciscan hospital with the grippe. He learns that Sebastian has been hosting and caring for a syphilitic German soldier, a deserter from the Foreign Legion. And Sebastian confides, quote, "You know, it's rather a pleasant change when all your life you've had people looking after you to have someone to look after yourself," end quote. This interaction, like others he's had with Sebastian over the many years, brings Charles very slowly, ineluctably, closer to God. We'll look at Cordelia there on the right, Sebastian's younger sister. She's also quite important to Charles. She is what one writer has called a truth teller in the novel. She calls things as they are. So when she first visits the adulterous Charles and Julia after many years abroad, she pulls no punches, saying, quote, "It's funny, thwarted is exactly the word I thought of for you and Julia, thwarted passion," calling it what it is. She then gives Charles news about Sebastian, who hasn't been seen in years. She's found him in French Tunisia by then, where he's tried to become a lay brother at a monastery, but usually drunk, he's been turned away time and again. Found sick and starving one day, Cordelia reveals that he's been at the infirmary ever since. She tells Charles that the monastery's superior prays for Sebastian regularly. Quote, "He was a very holy old man, and he recognized it in others." It? Holiness, Charles says. "Oh yes, Charles, that's what you've got to understand about Sebastian." He then asks, "I suppose he doesn't suffer." "Oh yes, I think he does," she replies. "One can have no idea what the suffering may be to be maimed as he is. No dignity, no power of will." And then she makes what I think is the most truthful and perhaps the most important statement in the entire book. No one is ever holy without suffering. As James Hitchcock has argued, the unsuspected truth is that Sebastian is a kind of saint. So Cordelia, through her friendship with Charles, really opens his eyes up to deeper, more mysterious aspects of the faith. Here's one of my favorite characters, Brideshead, Sebastian's older brother. He doesn't have the same intimate friendship with Charles, but he too plays an important role in Charles's conversion, primarily by serving as a voice of Catholic orthodoxy, as a source of moral teachings. At one point during the early stages of Sebastian's growing alcoholism, while still in England, Charles worries that Sebastian will soon be a physical wreck, and Bridie replies, quote, "There's nothing wrong in being a physical wreck, you know. There's no moral obligation to be postmaster general or master of foxhounds or to live to walk 10 miles at 80, end quote. Charles, of course, bristles at this. He goes, "Moral obligation? Now you're back on religion again, Bridie." "I never left it," he replies. There is also Bridie's bombshell, as it's called in the book, when he explains to his adulterous sister Julia and to Charles why he cannot ask his wife to visit them at Brideshead Castle, where they've shacked up. Bridie says, quote, "You must understand that my wife is a woman of strict Catholic principle, fortified by the prejudices of the middle class. I couldn't possibly bring her here. It is a matter of indifference whether you choose to live in sin with your husband or Charles or both. I have always avoided inquiry into the details of your ménage, but in no case would my wife consent to be your guest," end quote. These brief lines, direct and perhaps a bit ruthless, subsequently trigger Julia's fit of hysteria outside and her teary reflections on God and her love for Charles. So we'll talk about Julia on the left there with Charles. Julia is Charles's most important loving friendship in the book. Hers builds on his earlier love for Sebastian. During a stormy transatlantic ocean crossing at the start of their affair, she asks him, quote, "You loved Sebastian, didn't you?" He replies, "Oh yes, he was the forerunner." This is repeated later in the maturity of their affair, years later, when Julia remarks, "It's frightening to think how completely you've forgotten Sebastian." He replies, "He was the forerunner." "Yes, that's what you said in the storm." She then adds, "I've thought since perhaps I am only a forerunner too." To which Charles says to himself, "Perhaps." But then he continues with the following astonishing reflection. Quote, "Perhaps all our loves are merely hints and symbols, vagabond language scrawled on gateposts and paving stones along the weary road that others have tramped before us. Perhaps this sadness which sometimes falls between us," referring to Julia, "springs from disappointment in our search, each straining through and beyond the other, snatching a glimpse now and then of the shadow which turns the corner always a pace or two ahead of us." End quote. I think Charles here is just beginning to understand something about the ultimate end of that quest, of the spiritual quest, of the search for love. Another important moment occurs right after Bridie's bombshell, precisely as Julia is weeping by the fountain outside the castle for the death of her god. Charles tries to pacify her, saying, "You do know at heart that it's all bosh, don't you?" "How I wish it was," she says. Right there, we see an important change in Julia. Charles, at that moment, though, remains all at sea until we get to the death of Sebastian's father, Lord Marchmain, a bitter apostate. So here's the scene. The family's gathered around the old paterfamilias. The priest is asking an unconscious older man, basically, if he is sorry before he dies. Lord Marchmain can't reply. Everyone's praying around him, and Charles says to himself, or thinks, rather, quote, "I suddenly felt the longing for a sign, if only of courtesy, if only for the sake of the woman I loved, who knelt in front of me praying, I knew, for a sign. It seemed so small a thing that was asked, the bare acknowledgement of a present, a nod in the crowd. I prayed, God, forgive him his sins, and please, God, make him accept your forgiveness. So small a thing to ask." End quote. Lord Marchmain, as those of you who've read the novel or seen the movie know, then makes the sign of the cross. And Charles then realizes that, quote, "The sign I had asked for was not a little thing, not a passing nod of recognition, and a phrase came back to me from my childhood of the veil of the temple being rent from top to bottom," end quote. This is the precise moment when Charles's edifice of disbelief begins to crumble, and his conversion begins. More importantly, though, it also marks the moment when Julia knows she cannot marry him or be with him ever again. She tries to explain herself to Charles, quote, "I've always been bad, but the worse I am, the more I need God. I can't shut myself out from his mercy. That is what it would mean starting a life with you, Charles. It may be a private bargain between me and God that if I give up this one thing I want so much, however bad I am, he won't quite despair of me in the end," end quote. Her renouncement of her love for Charles is the final blow leading to Charles's conversion. As one scholar has put it, Charles and Julia are essentially the catalyst for the other's spiritual redemption. The late Salvatore Canals used to teach that Jesus is not the same in everyone, but according to a person's capacity to receive him, he shows himself as a child, or as an adolescent in full development, or as a mature man, end quote. I find this lovely and quite helpful. Applied to our material, it suggests that behind the various friendships that I've just summarized, there were real encounters with Christ. Paraphrasing another scholar, quote, "This succession of profane loves in Charles's life has brought him to his true destination, the love of God," end quote. Now, we're not privy to Charles's conversion at all, but it takes place somewhere between the end of his reminiscences and the epilogue. He goes from being an agnostic and mocking Catholicism as mumbo-jumbo to a believer. But we only know this from a few hints during his memories and from the epilogue. For example, at one point, fed up with the Flyte's Catholic drama, he says he is leaving behind illusion. He basically declares himself a realist. And he says, I now live in a world of 3 dimensions with the aid of my 5 senses. He then adds, I have since learned that there is no such world. Elsewhere, reflecting on one particularly idyllic 1920s summer, Charles recognizes, quote, I have come to accept claims which then, in 1923, I never troubled to examine, and to accept the supernatural as the real, end quote. It is only in the epilogue, back in the present, that we know for sure. For we see Charles walking around Brideshead Castle saying, quote, there was one part of the castle, I had not yet visited, and I went there now. And I said a prayer, an ancient, newly learned form of words, end quote. It seems Charles has finally submitted, after pursuing various disordered loves throughout his life, to the one true love written on his heart all along. This is, of course, not the only conversion in the book. Let's look at the Flytes very briefly. After years of dodging their duties and obligations, quote, chasing an illusion, a negative freedom from the responsibilities of faith, end quote, the 3 wayward Flytes all have accepted God's grace. Sebastian has embraced the cross through physical suffering, Julie has given up Charles for God, and Lord Marchmain has received the sacrament of extreme unction. Like St. Augustine, all of them had sought in vain for something, but in the end they were all powerless to resist God's grace. In conclusion, this is a great work of Catholic literary fiction. It's not just the story of a man emerging from the chaos of the carnal into the light of truth. It's also a reintegrative work, reminding us of the need to put God back in the world, have God in our fallen world. It's a work, as Joseph Pierce has written, of, quote, hope among the ruins of a vanishing civilization in which the light of Christianity shines on amid the chaos, end quote. We see just such a light on the last page as Charles looks upon the small red flame, and I forgot to move this. Here's the chapel. The small red flame of a beaten copper lamp in front of the tabernacle. That flame burns in testimony, one scholar has written, to what Waugh believed to be central to European, and I would say Western, culture. That is, the sacramental guarantee that God's real presence continues to work in history and continues to transform the lives of men and women everywhere. Thank you.
When Walker Percy was close to 60 years old, he wrote a short poem entitled Community. Here's the first stanza. I'll return to the rest of the poem at the end of my remarks. Now comes the artist to his life's surprise. A fond, abstract, middle-aged public man is he. Come to a place in his time when he thought he knew something. What? Namely, that on the short, lovely Louisiana afternoons, the winter sunlight making spaces, pale gold above, and in the live oaks a shafted gloom like rooms of moss and leaf and tenant squirrels and jeweled birds. He trafficked in loneliness, little brother, cellmate, and friend to himself, and even turned it to good use. A commodity, a good businessman selling solitariness, like GM selling Chevrolets or Burns furniture. A strange success, this selling to other selves, the very sealed offness of self from selves. Although I mean to say some things about Walker Percy and friendship, I need to begin with estrangement. Percy's parents settled in Birmingham, Alabama, after their wedding. where his father practiced law. The summer of 1929, when 13-year-old Percy and his younger brother Leroy were away at summer camp, Percy's 40-year-old father, like his grandfather 12 years before, committed suicide with a shotgun. His mother, distraught and lonely, moved with her 3 boys to Greenville, Mississippi, to join the household of Will Percy, her cousin by marriage, a single man, and the son of the late Senator Leroy Percy. Shortly before Percy's 17th birthday, his mother drove her car off a bridge outside of Greenville and drowned. The circumstances remain unclear, but Percy would always believe that his mother, too, had committed suicide. Uncle Will, lawyer, poet, plantation owner, adopted his nephews and offered them, wrote Percy later, a complete articulated view of the world, as tragic as it was noble. It was to be introduced to Shakespeare, Keats, Brahms, Beethoven, as one seldom, if ever, meets them in school. But a close friend also called Uncle Will the loneliest man he ever knew. Percy attended the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and medical school at Columbia. While in New York City, he underwent a year of psychoanalysis, 4 days a week, with a therapist influenced by the psychoanalyst Harry Stack Sullivan, who emphasized loneliness as a major developmental issue. Not long after, he contracted tuberculosis and spent several years at a sanatorium in Saranac Lake, New York. TB, he later said, is the best thing that ever happened to me. Here's Percy. I was in bed so much, alone so much, that I had nothing to do but read or think. This is an academic's dream, I think. I began to question everything I had once believed. I began to ask why Europe, why the world had come to such a sorry state. I never turned my back on science, but I gradually began to realize that as a scientist, a doctor, a pathologist, I knew so very much about man, but had little idea what man is. Percy read Kierkegaard, who he said saw the problem most clearly, Heidegger, Marcel, Sartre, and Camus. Raised something of an agnostic, though he attended various Protestant churches now and then, his illness and the reading and reflection it made possible shook him to his core. And when he was discharged at the age of 30, he decided to convert to Catholicism and wed Mary Bernice Townsend. I need you to be my wife, he telegrammed. I'm neurotic as hell. I need you to get me out of my state. I love you. It's got to be the best proposal anybody's ever made. They settled in New Orleans, where Percy gave up medicine in order to write 6 novels, scores of essays, and the difficult to categorize tour de force, Lost in the Cosmos. I've not lingered over Percy's biography from mere casual interest. His life as a Catholic husband, father of 2 girls, novelist, and philosopher, found its wellspring in the bitter loss of his grandfather and his parents, his long sickness, and the intense reflection his sickness made possible. Suicide in particular haunts Percy's writing, as it did his life. Kate in The Moviegoer has suicidal tendencies. Will Barrett in The Last Gentleman is preoccupied with the suicide of his father and barely escapes suicide himself in The Second Coming. Thomas More spends some time in a sanatorium after a failed suicide attempt in Love in the Ruins. Percy, though never himself tempted by suicide, struggled with depression and saw that the possibility of suicide forces each of us to ask, what makes life worth living? The answer Percy found while resting and reading in upstate New York was that his own personal struggles with loneliness, depression, and a familial disposition to suicide were emblematic of human life. Instead of a disease to be cured, the loneliness of oneself, its estrangement from others, from the world, even from one's own heart. This alienation was the fate of all those living in the 20th century. Even more, he said, Judeo-Christianity, and here's a longish quote from Percy, gave an account of alienation, not as a peculiar evil of the 20th century, but as the enduring symptom of man's estrangement from God. Human existence was by no means to be understood as the transaction of a higher organism satisfying this or that need from its environment by being creative or enjoying meaningful relationships. If anyone ever says they want a meaningful relationship with you, you should run. But as the journey of a wayfarer along life's way. The experience of alienation was thus not a symptom, I'm still quoting Percy, of maladaptation, psychology, nor evidence of the absurdity of life, existentialism, nor an inevitable consequence of capitalism, Marx. Though the exacerbating influence of these forces was not denied, it was not to be forgotten that human alienation was first and last the homelessness of a man who is not, in fact, at home. How remarkably comforting this must have been for Percy. Loneliness and depression were not symptoms of illness, whether psychological or existential, nor reflections of the peculiar troubles of modern life, but instead precious reminders that we are wayfarers, pilgrims, journeying home. All of Percy's writing fits, in one way or another, into a threefold pattern. We find ourselves more or less in the situation of Thomas More in Love in the Ruins. The first thing a man remembers, says More, is longing, and the last thing he's conscious of before death is exactly the same longing. If we're fortunate, we recognize our condition and see that it is part of human nature, rather than mere private weakness or sickness or the external maladies of the times. And if we're truly fortunate, we come to see this condition as a good one, the reminder that we are journeying home to our Maker. I'd like to retell Percy's first novel, The Moviegoer, in order to show some of the things I've been saying and to see how human love and friendship might connect to them. Binks Bowling, the week before Ash Wednesday, his 30th birthday, is a model tenant and a model citizen and takes pleasure in doing all that is expected of him. He manages a small branch office of his uncle's brokerage firm and does comfortably well, enjoying, he says, the consolation of making money. In the evenings, he watches television or goes to the movies. Once I thought, he says, of going into law or medicine or even pure science. I even dreamed of doing something great. But there's much to be said for giving up such grand ambitions and living the most ordinary life imaginable, a life without the old longings. For years now, he says, I've had no friends. I spend my entire time working, making money, going to movies, and seeking the company of women. But this morning, for the first time in a long time, there occurs to him the possibility of a search. The search, he says, is what anyone would undertake if he were not sunk in the everydayness of his own life. To become aware of the possibility of the search is to be onto something, and not to be onto something is to be in despair. His Aunt Emily, 65, and an old Southern Stoic, and, as Percy admitted, something like his Uncle Will, likes to say she is an Episcopalian by emotion, a Greek by nature, and a Buddhist by choice. She reads the great books and says, I don't know quite what we're doing on this insignificant cinder spinning away in a dark corner of the universe. Yet one thing I believe, and I believe it with every fiber of my being, a man must live by his lights and do what little he can, and do it as best he can. In this world, goodness is destined to be defeated, but a man must go down fighting. Today, she's invited Binks over for one of her serious talks. She asks him to help her stepdaughter, Kate, who is approaching the point where it becomes more and more difficult for her to meet people. As Binks remembers, in grade school, Kate had no friends. Instead of playing at recess, she would do her lessons and sit quietly at her desk until class began. I have 5 children. That doesn't sound so bad to me, actually. I wouldn't mind a little more of that. Fight with her, joke with her, Aunt Emily says. Do whatever it is you used to do to put her at her ease. Kate is going through something I don't understand. Kate and Binks grew up together after the death of Binks's father. And when Binks goes to see her, Kate says, "You're like me, but worse." And there's much truth in that. They're both alone and lonely. They're both awake to the search, though Binks more so than Kate. Binks first discovered the search when he was shot in the Korean War, and as he lay on the ground, the world in his predicament seemed visible for the first time. Kate's happiest moment, she says, came after she escaped with minor injuries from a car crash that killed her fiancé, though not because it killed her fiancé. Somehow, for both of them, confronting and escaping death makes the mystery of life present, immediate to them, and so makes the search possible. They also can't help but speak the truth. "I tell Kate the truth," says Binks, "because I have not the wit to tell her anything else." And Kate knows it. Percy's main characters are always truth-tellers, a sign of their longing for communion. Here's Thomas More in Love Among the Ruins in a wonderful passage. "When I left the hospital, I resolved not to lie. Lying cuts one off. Lying to someone is like blindfolding him. You cannot see the other's eyes to see how he sees you, and so you do not know how it stands with yourself." And whereas Aunt Emily is stoic, Kate and Binks both desire beauty. Though Binks sees a deep sadness in the old courage, as well as the charms of beauty. "Joy and sadness come by turns, I know now," he says. "Beauty and bravery make you sad." Sharon's beauty, Sharon is his secretary, and my aunt's bravery and victory breaks your heart. Finally, and most importantly, Kate and Binks each rescue each other. Various misadventures befall them the week before Ash Wednesday. Binks spends a day out with Sharon and visits his Catholic mother and his stepsisters and brothers. Kate flirts with suicide, breaks off her engagement to another man. Binks and Kate together escape New Orleans for Chicago, where Binks attends a financial conference, only to be called back by Aunt Emily, who upbraids Binks for taking the fragile Kate away without telling anyone. Finally, on Ash Wednesday, Binks thinks Kate has left him. He proposed to her, and she seemed to accept, but that was before Aunt Emily called them back. He gives in to despair, and so to desire. "My search has been abandoned," he says. "It's no match for my aunt, her rightness and her despair. It's certain now that my aunt is right, and that Kate knows it, and that nothing is left but Sharon." But he spots Kate in her car, waiting for him. Is it possible, Binks says to himself, that perhaps it is not too late? A little later, Kate says, "I'm frightened when I'm alone, and I'm frightened when I'm with people. The only time I'm not frightened is when I'm with you. You'll have to be with me a great deal." But while they rescue each other, they don't satisfy each other. "There's only one thing I can do," says Binks. "Listen to people. See how they stick themselves into the world. Hand them along a ways in their journey, and be handed along." Percy structured much of this novel, like his others, around Kierkegaard's 3 stages of existence: the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious. Kate and Binks are drawn to the aesthetic, and Aunt Emily to the ethical. But Kierkegaard and Percy saw both the aesthetic and the ethical as unsatisfying. And if you pass both, you are left with a predicament. Either existence is absurd, or we are a pilgrim people, searching, longing to return to God. This second choice, the religious stage, is the quiet but triumphant undercurrent of the moviegoer. The short epilogue, set a year and a half after the main action around Ash Wednesday, shows Cade and Binks married and returning from the funeral of Binks's half-brother Lonnie, who died just shy of his 15th birthday. Percy doesn't allow us an easy conclusion regarding Binks's search. Percy said once that you have to be wary of using words like religion, God, sin, salvation, baptism, because the words are almost worn out. The themes have to be implicit rather than explicit. As for my search, says Binks, I have not the inclination to say much on the subject. For one thing, I have not the authority, as the great Danish philosopher declared, to speak of such matters in any way other than the edifying. For another thing, it's not open to me even to be edifying, since the time is later than his, much too late to edify or do much of anything except plant a foot in the right place as the opportunity presents itself, if indeed ass-kicking is properly distinguished from edification. But the final scene recreates the end of Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, when Alyosha comforts a group of boys at the grave of a friend who has just died. Is it really true, they say, what religion says, that we shall all rise up from the dead and come to life and see one another again? Without question we shall rise. Without question we shall see one another and joyfully tell one another everything that has happened, says Alyosha. And Binks's little sister asks him, when our Lord raises us up on the last day, will Lonnie still be in a wheelchair, or will he be like us? He'll be like you, Binks replies. All Christian literature is hopeful, and so Walker Percy's novels are, all of them, hopeful. But human life is bittersweet, and Christian novelists tend to lean more towards the bitter or more towards the sweet. Tolkien, Lewis, Chesterton savored the sweet, the beauty of the sensuous. If I could hazard a name for this kind of writing, I would call it incarnational, for it expresses a special love of the created world, the things that are not God, though they are of him. Walker Percy does appreciate the created world, though you wouldn't know it, I'm afraid, from what I've been saying. His books are all, in the deepest sense, comedies and very funny. But he, like Flannery O'Connor and Sigrid Undset, is wary of lingering over the world at the expense of its creator. He prefers to show the inadequacy of creation, its impoverishment in contrast with the divine. Now, I've come to the end and haven't said much yet about friendship, but everything is in place to say what needs to be said. We moderns sometimes imagine that friendship and love will complete us, but Percy rejects this. Our friends and our lovers, like everything God gives us, will never satisfy us. Instead, Percy's image of friendship is the road to Emmaus. We 2 or 3 are journeying together, and the Lord is with us on the hard path, though we might not recognize him. And he is glad for us to listen to people, see how they stick themselves into the world, hand them along a ways in their journey, and be handed along. Our friends see with us that we are searching, that we cannot fill each other's longing in our hearts, and because of this we have leave to be gentle with one another, to care for and be patient with our brokenness. Friends, if I may go so far, celebrate together the sadness that is no indication of failure or inadequacy or the times we live in, but is instead the long, slender thread leading us home. Let me conclude with the second and final stanza of the poem I began with. Now comes the surprise. What? That in the very things he had denied and done so well denying, friendship, laughter, good red wine, well, anyhow, early times. Maréchal merriness, Lynn loveliness, all the good things we Catholics used to stand for until something went wrong. Did I help them go wrong? I hope not. I only named the wrongness, which in a way is to make it right and turn it around. But what a surprise! 20 years of solitariness and success at solitariness. Solitary with his family, like the Swiss family on their island. Then all at once community. Community? What friends out there in the world? Yes. Thank you.
In my right hand, I have the latest in a 33-year epistolary friendship from my friend Matt Lusky. His game has come down a bit because it used to be stationary with his monogrammed. This is just some kind of proletariat stock stuff from the University of Minnesota, but I cherish it. Over in my hand over here, I have a cell phone, and I have probably during this talk, there'll be a text from my 8 high school buddies. We've kept going for a lot of years. They range from the puerile to the profound. And they, there's also photos and memes. So it strikes me as somehow pre-Reformation in that register, but here we go. I was going to say more about friendship and digital spaces during this talk, but there's too much there. So you might get something along the way. So I'll focus on kind of conventional epistolary friendships. And so whether figured as Crown of Life, C.S. Lewis, or the Elixir of Life from the Book of Sirach, or by considering the countless other beautiful metaphors that exist, friendship remains today not only a central value in human life, but also serves as the primary relationship that motivates and fires so many of our human discourses: literature, poetry, and the arts, philosophy, politics, civic life. But there's something unique to learn about friendship when we look at it unfold in epistolary spaces. So many good novels are epistolary novels, perhaps because access to a character's inner life and thought stimulates the thickening of plots. But it's likely something more. Still, think of The Sorrows of Young Werther, Frankenstein by Shelley, The Screwtape Letters, Silence by Endo, and more recently, Gilead by Marilyn Robinson, Francis and Bernard by Carleen Bauer, and for you academics out there, you must read Dear Committee Members by Julie Schumacher. So many important dimensions are encountered and revealed in the genre, and the deft crafting of letters by authors vastly enhances the literary quality of texts. So too, the long tradition of letter writing in non-literary settings is indispensable. Consider the many epistolary friendships that have enlightened and enriched our learning. Too many late modern examples to adduce here, but these few will kick us into gear. And think of these: Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, Elizabeth Bishop and Robert Lowell, Chesterton and Hilary Belloc, C.S. Lewis, of course, and Tolkien and all the Inklings. And again, that's another part of the paper I wanted to do. I teach a course in Oxford every other summer, and I was going to call it Religion, Literature, and the British Imagination. And the suits at Loyola said, that's not sexy enough. And I said, what do you mean it's not sexy enough? So I did what anybody would do who's like me, and I turned to my wife, and Margie, and she said, no problem. Just put From Hobbits to Hogwarts on the front of that, and you're in. And it fills up every time. There is also with Lewis and Tolkien, there's that, you two, the shared love of, the romantic Christianity that they both espoused. But that friendship was stressed too. The what you two exists alongside the more mundane disturbances of people in our lives. There's the fullness that Raymond was just speaking about. There's a holistic scope in our friendships that need not be idealized. And this reminds me too, one more thing. Margie's idea was to hand out cards with stamps on them during this talk, so you could write a letter to your friend. And I forgot the basket on the table on the way home, on the way out of Chicago. And so my best friend Margie will forgive me, I'm sure, but she'll also make fun of me. So these great friendships, like Evelyn Waugh, of course, and Thomas Merton, they had a nice long epistolary relationship. Denise Levertov and Robert Duncan, that one broke over poetry and politics, but really it was theology that broke that one too. How about this one? Jacques Maritain and Saul Alinsky. Was that really, they wrote a lot. Were they really friends? That's something to look at. And then, of course, Justin Timberlake and Ryan Gosling, but we'll leave that. We not even mentioned the longer tradition here of St. Paul, of course, Augustine, Abelard, and Heloise, Luther, and Melanchthon. I work at Loyola, so we can't leave out St. Ignatius, who wrote 8,000 letters, mostly to Jesuits, but also to non-Jesuits, and letters that set the stage for a practice that remains central in Ignatian spirituality today, that of spiritual conversations anchored in Ignatius's revolutionary and ever-durable spiritual exercises. And that's the dearest message I think I can convey, that epistolary relationships, when done well, are nothing if not fecundating spiritual conversations. Oh, I have slides. Let me go over here. So that's Flannery from her journal, Flannery O'Connor. My epistolary powers enthrall me. She was 19 when she wrote that, so let's have a... and I wanted to put that on there for longer, but I need to go to... actually, I'll leave it there. What I plan to do here is to explore the power of epistolary friendships as a sign of both advanced friendships and an instrument of spiritual conversation. In short, by considering just a few pointed epistolary moments of friendship in the correspondences of two well-known Catholic writers, Gerard Hopkins and Flannery O'Connor, both of whom I hasten to note died young, we begin to see in epistolary life something stark and beautiful, letter writing as a sacrament of human friendship. The very act of writing itself adds essential dimensions to our friendships and shuttles our intimacy to more profound levels. There's an irony here, though, of course, because proximity is so vital in friendships. But so too, how often it is that we speak our hearts and minds with candor and trust precisely when we are physically apart from one another, precisely when we are in moments of privacy and contemplation. So much in Christian life proceeds from inversions such as this, and letter writing in particular brings this into fuller view. In this sense, letter writing and regular correspondence serve friendships in ways both pointed and textured, as an organ of personal intimacy, as a vehicle to convey intellectual and emotional claritas, and as a venue for spiritual and religious growth. When we meet again, in between the writing of our letters, our relationship is transformed a little bit, and we are moved further down the pilgrim path of our shared expedition. What is more, when we consider exemplary letters with care, especially when written by people who know how to write things, we too are uniquely drawn into the correspondence and are much improved by the experience. But let me offer, an observation and maybe even a caveat here. While letters engender deeper intimacy between friends, they also serve as signposts in the spiritual biographies and unfolding drama of our lives in God. And this almost always is messy. This is to say that not every epistolary friendship in the Christian milieu, or any milieu for that matter, has a so-called happy ending. Life is complicated, no matter one's spiritual state, and we all dwell in the mystery of human freedom, even while we pray for grace. It is no accident that Flannery O'Connor, even if she respects the philosophical ideals associated with friendship, is a Christian realist in the Thomist vein. Fallibility and sinfulness are key facts of being, and her stories almost always take place in purgatorial spaces, trains, buses, doctors' offices. O'Connor knows that we are ever in the crucible and that existence often works us like galley slaves. But it is her response to this drama, her most astute theological understanding that blends a high regard for moral clarity with a mercy that runs even deeper, that become for her the habit of being, that permeates her literary imagination, her spirituality, and her epistolary friendships. In a 1956 letter to William Sessions, who became Flannery's literary executor, by the way, Flannery deftly discloses the unique power of epistolary spaces to engender, understand, and cultivate friendship. Do you know the Hopkins-Bridges correspondence? She writes, Bridges wrote to Hopkins at one point and asked him how he could possibly learn to believe, expecting, I suppose, a metaphysical answer. Hopkins only said, give alms. In the letter excerpted above, O'Connor is counseling her unlikely young friend and regular correspondent about drawing deeper relationships with God himself and the hard scrabble demands of living a Christian life precisely by invoking this dialogue. Hopkins and Bridges were an unconventional pair. They met at Oxford, and they shared poems with one another, but then they wrote over many years lifelong correspondence characterized by off-colliding opinions on politics and culture and art. And their many conversations about belief and practice are as much in harmony as dissonance. Yet they remain true friends to the last. Both were ardent theists, even if their theological styles were markedly different. Hopkins was a Catholic convert in the St. John Henry Newman vein, and then became a Jesuit priest. Bridges was a physician poet, was a cross between a Christian classicist and a new century man, a kind of middle church theosophist. O'Connor's invocation of the pair honors the depth of their love, just as it serves the particular message of the letter, and Sessions needed to hear that. Sessions figures into the talk at the end here, but let's look at Hopkins and Bridges. You know, along with Newman and Charles Péguy and Léon Blois, Hopkins is a key figure for understanding and articulating the intellectual, social, and aesthetic stakes of late 19th into early 20th century kind of religion and culture and intellectual life. These four conveyed the depth, and without them, we'd really be at a loss, I think. But we wouldn't have known about Hopkins at all had it not been for Bridges, his beloved friend, who published Hopkins's poems in 1918. About, this is 30 years after Hopkins dies. The original edition of these poems gathered a small, enthusiastic audience, but would not reach widespread popularity until 1930 in an edition edited by Charles Williams. And since then, Hopkins is in every anthology, republished poems everywhere, critical editions, so many translations, and yet Bridges is faded from view, which is interesting. So, Hopkins was well ahead of his time, anticipating a literary movement, maybe modernism to a point, and of course theological depth, a theological aesthetics of a high register. But no one knew this while he lived, and it's no surprise because we know well that no prophet is accepted in his native place. While it's most valuable to have these poems, we only get one side of the dialogue. Hopkins' letters were carefully kept by Bridges, and they were published, but the letters that Bridges had written were sent back to him after his friend's death. So Bridges' letters came back, and he destroyed them. The consequence of this asymmetry is that it's most difficult to assess Bridges' personal reactions to the views expressed so frankly by Hopkins on those rich topics. We will encounter this phenomenon momentarily when we turn to O'Connor and her 9-year correspondence with Betty Hester. Different through line and a different result, but it's similar. We don't always have Hester's point of view either, or Bridges' point of view, and discerning readers are tasked with constructing credible scenarios against absent texts. In an 1879 letter written from Oxford, Hopkins writes to his friend about his belief. And so Hopkins writes, "I should also like to say one thing. You understand, of course, that I desire to see you a Catholic, if not that, a Christian, or if not that, at least a believer in the true God. For you told me something of your views about the deity, which were not as they should be. It also might and ought to turn on something further, in fact, on prayer. And that suggestion, I believe, I did once make to you. But I have another counsel open to no objection, and yet I think it will be unexpected. I lay great stress on it. It is to give alms." I dare say, indeed, you do give alms. Still, I should say, give more. I should be so bold to say, give up to the point of sensible inconvenience. I am now talking pure Christianity, as you may remember, but I also am talking pure sense, as you must see. Now you may have done much good, but yet it may not be enough. I will say, it is not enough. Believe me, your affectionate friend, Gerard Hopkins, S.J. Bridges, of course, cherishes this dialogue and was, even if he was mystified by his friend's inexplicable, radical, and absolute Catholic commitments. We don't know what Bridges says, though, but he does write to A.E. Hausman. And he writes, I am editing the poems of an old college friend, my contemporary at Oxford, Gerard Hopkins, a bally little man and fine scholar, became a Jesuit very foolishly, pervert, before he took his degree and died 30 years ago in Dublin, rotten with melancholy, because being a patriot, he could not stomach the treason of his spiritual associates and directors, perishing of typhoid fever. For all of our candor and time together, our friends are often mysteries to us. So often, too, we are mysteries to ourselves. But let us let Hopkins make an answer to the harrowing mistake of which Bridges accuses him in this late poem from 1885. Soul, self, come, poor Jack self, I do advise you, jaded, let be. Call off thoughts a while elsewhere. Leave comfort root room. Let joy sighs at God knows when to God knows what. Whose smile, snot wrung, see you, unforeseen times rather, as skies between pie mountains, lights a lovely mile. Just as Bridges brought Hopkins into the world, so too did Sally Fitzgerald bring Flannery into the world, her letters. I'm going to kind of run over this because in the interest of time, but there's a long record of Flannery writing everybody. These letters are wonderful. She writes Robert Lowell, Elizabeth Bishop, John Hawkes, Walker Percy, Alan Tate, Caroline Gordon, Catherine Ann Porter. These are great. They're the backbone of the book, but these other letters to like Betty Hester are in another category. Extraordinary glimpses of Flannery as kind of part spiritual director and part theologian, maybe even part saint. We see that Hester and O'Connor were true friends, and how things evolved in their drama together is really quite striking. Hester wrote O'Connor in 1955, 2 years after being dishonorably discharged from the army for having an illicit sexual affair with a woman. O'Connor, then 30 years old, was already the author of a novel, and Hester really struck O'Connor because she was a good reader, theologically astute and kind of literary chops. Hester had a library of 4,000 volumes. She was always reading and writing. An early letter here discloses the depth of their friendship as Hester struggles to believe the central mystery of Christianity, which of course is the incarnation. And we can detect that Hester has written something and taken kind of an Arianist or an adoptionist track, as O'Connor replies, and this is in 1955, I can never agree with you that the incarnation or any truth has to satisfy emotionally to be right. And I would not agree that for the natural man, the incarnation does not satisfy emotionally. It does not satisfy emotionally for the person brought up under many forms of false intellectual discipline, such as 19th century mechanism. For instance, the truth does not change according to our ability to stomach it emotionally. A higher paradox confounds emotion as well as reason, and there are long periods in the lives of all of us and the saints when the truth as revealed by faith is hideous, emotionally disturbing, downright repulsive. Witness the dark night of the soul in individual saints. Right now, the whole world seems to be going through a dark night of the soul. That was 1955, and I guess there's nothing new under the sun. O'Connor began after this to begin a low-key campaign to coax Hester into the Catholic Church, and this worked. But they began to share things very personally, and Hester began to reveal a great deal more about her, that she battled mood swings, drank a bit too much, and most significantly, witnessed her mother's suicide when she was 14 years old. In the quiet sturdiness of the epistolary spaces, O'Connor assures her friend, quote, "Where you are wrong is in saying that you are a history of horror. The meaning of redemption is precisely that we do not have to be our history, and nothing is plainer to me than that you are not your history." She added, "Understand from my point of view that you are always wanted." More, this is Halloween 1956. This was a recently released one. It was kind of embargoed for 20 years after Hester's death. O'Connor crafted a response to Hester revealing her sexuality in this stunning in its tenderness. Flannery writes, "I can't write you fast enough and tell you that it doesn't make the slightest bit of difference in my opinion of you. You were right to tell me, but I'm glad you didn't tell me until I knew you well. But you wonder whether it makes any difference to me if you drop out of my life? Yes, it does make a difference. It would be impossible for me to let you. The fact is, I have a spiritual relationship with you. I am your sponsor, self-appointed from the time you first wrote me and appointed by me afterwards, which means I have the right to stay where I have been put." Now, examining the complexities of human sexuality is a necessary thing, but this is well beyond the scope here. It's enough to observe here that O'Connor proceeds as Jesus might, tries to see Hester as Jesus does, neither with judgment nor endorsement, but with love, friendship, and mercy. Still, as I move toward the conclusion, Hester felt the church in ill fit. According to Bill Sessions, who remained very close with Hester until her death in 1998, Hester called the 5 years that she was a Catholic the worst of her life. She left the Catholic Church and turned to agnosticism, and O'Connor believed that she knew whom to blame. This conversion was achieved by Miss Iris Murdoch. She wrote to a friend, Hester doesn't believe any longer that Christ is God, and so she has found that he is beautiful, beautiful. Everything is in the eek, eek, eureka stage. So Hester had a 30-year relationship starting in 1961, right after with Iris Murdoch. It's another long one with her. In any case, that's also a topic for a good paper. But as we close here, and that's Hester on the right, that's Jenny Sessions, Bill Sessions, and that's Sally Fitzgerald, habit of being editor. In 1998, Betty Hester committed suicide at the age of 75 with a hollow-nosed bullet aimed at her skull after spending the afternoon eating a day-late Christmas dinner and playfully mocking Bill Sessions for taking the church seriously. According to Sessions, the next week they learned this and they went to her home, her apartment, and next to her body on the side table was a copy of Cheers, which is the Flannery O'Connor newsletter, and spattered with blood. It's a rough one, but so too is the fatigue of bipolarity and mental illness and the soul sickness of alcoholism. Those are rough things. But maybe the love between the two women from the 1950s touches us in this very moment. There is a theology for that, after all. God's love of friends transcends not only time, but even our brokenness. And even broken friendships retain something of the very love that engendered their life in bloom. And perhaps it is simply this that is enough, and so we leave it in the last word for Flannery and her loving kindness to her friend Betty. I can see now how very much grace you have really been given, and that is all that is necessary for me to know in this matter. What is necessary for you to know is my very real love for you and my very real admiration for you. Yours truly, Flannery. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our speakers and for being so conscientious about time. We actually now have 20 minutes for Q&A. So I'd invite you all to approach the microphones if you'd like to make a comment or ask a question, or if the panelists themselves would like to ask one another anything. So please, you're welcome to join the conversation.
Hi, my name is Thomas. I'm a student here. Dr. Murphy, I have a question for you. First of all three of you, thank you very much for speaking today. So my question, how necessary is it in these relationships to be together, to spend time together? Like, can you truly know someone through simply writing letters, or what is the extent to which you have to be actually physically together to have a lasting relationship?
I would hate to just to retreat into the both and answer that you hear so often in Catholic stuff, but my gosh, St. Ignatius sustains some friendships with his brothers from thousands of miles away. It was very intimate. But I also know proximity means everything in our lives. Brian Stevenson's book, Just Mercy, we won't really inhabit an intimacy with other people unless we kind of smell them. That's incarnational. We have to be centrally located. So I'm happy we have the option to go other places, but I don't think it's an either or, even though I know that my friendships have been enriched by letter writing and distance, but it's both for me. Thanks for the question.
Hi, my name is Shannon. Thank you so much to all three of you. I learned so much. I wanted to ask you, Professor Fantini, about if you could just talk a little bit about the role of Lady Marchmain on Charles.
The role of the what? I'm sorry?
Of Lady Marchmain on Charles. I think one of my favorite lines that Cordelia says is that when people want to hate God, they just hate Mummy instead, because the resentment is that they think she's a monster, but really, she's a saint, and that if your mother were a saint, or it would breed a little resentment. So I think she's often misread, but I don't hear a lot about her place in his conversion on that ladder of love, and I just wondered if you could just go for a couple minutes on that.
Right, sure. No, I like her too. I like Bridie and Lady Marchmain. I know Lady Marchmain's received a lot of criticism because she's oppressive, because she's pushy. But I think she provides exactly what Charles and the other members of her family need. She's always gently, lovingly trying to get them back, pointing the way. She never wavers from her own faith. One of my favorite lines is about the camels. I didn't catch the one you quoted, but where she says that it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle, etc. That's one of my favorite moments in the story. But I think she's essential. I think she and Bridie are great characters in the novel, and I resist those critics of Lady Marchmain who point to her as some kind of nasty, ghoulish woman. Maybe you want to add something? Okay.
Hi, thank you. I loved all of that. That was beautiful. I named a baby Sebastian after Sebastian Flyte. I just want to add that when I did research on Brideshead Revisited in college, I came across this quotation. I just want to add to the Lady Marchmain question. Waugh was asked, "Are you on her side?" And he said, "I'm not, but God is, who suffers fools gladly." So I thought I'd just add that.
Nice. That's nice. Thank you. That's great.
I have a question for Professor Hain. I'm Michael Crum, St. Vincent College. I've never thought about this before, but you made me think about it, and actually connects with the other two papers. The way that a friend helps us to imagine seeing the world in a different way that we might not be inclined or attracted to. So Lonnie Smith with Binks Bowling, he clearly enjoys playing the game of Catholic theology with him and trying to coach him through, should you fast? But it may be that Lonnie's death forces him to realize that it's not good enough for your friend to take these things seriously. So I'm wondering at the end of the book, is it possibly Lonnie's death that brings Binks around to reconsidering or to actually embracing, the book's ambiguous, I guess, the faith in a way that in the past he's just kind of pushing it off as, I don't have to answer that. So can a friend sometimes be a crutch in that sense of that, oh, my friend is adopting that, taking it up, I myself might not have to. So just thinking through that. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Is anyone considering naming their child Binks? I think it might be time for that.
Nice. Good answer.
Percy is reluctant to be clear about what precisely moves his characters towards the transcendent, towards grace. I myself, reading The Moviegoer, think that Lonnie, the little quote I mentioned about truth-telling from Thomas More, the relationship between Lonnie and Binks is one of truth-telling. And there's a bit of comedy behind that relationship. They laugh at each other. It also allows them to laugh at themselves, which is very important to the two of them, I think. You're sort of asking whether or not Binks might have converted, if we agree that he did, had Binks not died. And I suppose I think Binks still would have ended up, in the end, in the place of Alyosha, in some fashion responding to grace successfully, even if Lonnie had not died. That being said, I do think that in all of Percy's work, death is crucial as a moment of an opportunity for recognition, for seriousness about life. Reminds me a little bit of Waldstein's talk previously, the question about death and life always being present together. I think the novel works the way it does partly because Lonnie dies. So in a sense, I want to say, yes, Lonnie needs to die at the end. Although, in a sense, too, he didn't have to. I think Binks would have ended up in some fashion on the religious way of life at the end, even without that.
My question is for Professor Hain also. I just actually moved here from Covington, Louisiana, where I spent the last 20 years of my life. My youngest child was supposed to be William Percy Baglow, but my wife stole the middle name and gave it to Edmund Campion, so that's how that rolls. But anyway, I was wondering, as you were talking about this, I thought about a novel that of Percy's that also exemplifies friendship, though in very strange ways, and that was Lancelot. And I'm just wondering if you would give any commentary on friendships through knocking on walls and also through just listening.
Yeah, great. What a great example. I think Lancelot is Percy's most troubling novel in lots of different ways. It's unusual. It's different from the other five in certain ways. I mean, one of the things Percy's doing in that novel, I think, is taking, well, his main character, Lancelot, is looking for the existence of evil. If he can find one sin, he says, he will somehow prove that God exists. So it's kind of a back door to grace in some fashion. Communication is a permanent preoccupation of Percy's. I said nothing about his debts to Perce, and I could have. If I'd had more time, I think we would need to talk about that. Perce gave Percy, the philosopher, Charles Sanders Peirce, gave Percy a way of thinking about human life as intrinsically limited with respect to our communication with one another. Our language both draws us closer and separates us as something that comes between us. So Percy's always looking for things that allow us a more intimate form of communication than what we usually have. So the knocking that Lancelot engages in with his fellow inmate in the sanatorium, the silences with Percival, his conversation partner in Lancelot. I do think, and maybe this connects to the epistolary questions as well, we make a mistake if we think that talking is the way we communicate with one another always and everywhere. There are many very profound ways of communication that are not verbal. And Percy sees those as potentially very powerful ways of shaking us out of a certain kind of stupor. So the talking's crucial for him. The silence is crucial. I mean, you get to know about Percival through the novel by Lancelot reacting to things Percival does. He goes to the window, or he says something, and Lancelot sort of repeats it for you or something. And then at the very end, Percival comes in and speaks. So one thing to say in response to your question is that the knocking and the silences are very important. But the other thing to say is that at the end of the novel, we get the sense that the second half is coming when Percival speaks in return. And we don't get to see that. So there's still conversation coming off stage, so to speak.
I'm sorry to report we're actually out of time. We're supposed to end at noon instead of 12:15. So thank you very much to our panelists and to our questioners. It was a wonderful session.